Welcome back. And whilst we are trying to top up our coffee cups, I'm just going to do the introduction. So again, my name is Christoph Sauermann. I'm the academic director of iCAAD, incidentally the CEO. And this is not why I'm here today. I'm here today to introduce Dr. David Greenfield. It's something I was really looking forward because I've been working with David since September in Cape Cod to make that possible. Dr. Greenfield holds a PhD. He's the founder of the Center for Internet and Technology Addiction and also an assistant clinical professor of psychiatry at the University of Connecticut School of Medicine. So this is about the credentials. Now, most importantly, and this is what matters to me here as a practitioner, David has this fantastic combination of a gusto for research and findings and thorough research, and also is a practitioner. And this is what I really wanted to bring this year. We wanted to bring at iCAAD as someone who could not only describe the theory of the problem we're addressing today, but also how does this work when we have to face clients and patients. So having said all that, the title today is Plug Back into Life, Treatment Consideration in Internet Use Disorders. I never thought about all what you told me and explained me in the last months, and I've known already so much. So I'm just going to leave it there and hand it over to you, David, because there's so much to learn, and it's fast moving, and it's such a problem we're facing right now. It's a civilization problem, not a clinical room problem, I believe. Thank you so much. Welcome, David.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. And with that,
it's just, there's all this pressure, you know? And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me, and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's gonna stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever gonna stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
No, see, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See, you're
out.
not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just, sometimes it's like, there's this achy, I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
That sounds really hard.
he's learning.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Oh, come on. If you would just...
Don't.
Try to see things my way. Do I have to keep on talking till I can't go on? We can work it.
So why did I show you that? One, just to get you laughing, because it's easier to keep a group laughing than get started from scratch. But I really wanted to get your attention in a real-time, visceral way. That's why I'm here, and you're not watching me on a podcast or reading a book or seeing me on a video. There's something about real-time connection, real-time interaction, face-to-face connection with other people that's still very important. And we haven't been able to really digitize that or put that in a pocket. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, both in terms of some of the theoretical reasons, in terms of how this is developed, and also the clinical implications and some treatment strategies that we've been using at our clinic for the last 20 years. So this is what an internet addict looks like, or what People magazine thought they looked like in 2000, actually, or 1999. So that's actually me, believe it or not. So a lot's changed. Obviously, what we look like now is everybody in this room who carries a computer more powerful than the most powerful computer that we had back then in our pockets. It's a very different time. Although I've done a lot of research on this topic, as Christoph said, I'm primarily a clinician. I'm a medical director of a clinic, an outpatient clinic that does traditional outpatient psychiatric service, as well as intensive outpatient. We're also right on the cusp of opening a 30-bed residential treatment program in the United States for the treatment of internet and technology addiction that would hopefully be open by the end of the summer. So can we connect and be disconnected at the same time? Not so sure. The data is not good in terms of the pseudo-connection and the alienation that people feel with regard to their technology, and we'll talk more about that. But suffice it to say that connecting through these devices is not analogous to real-time connection. Social media really isn't social media, it's really anti-social media. And I'll explain that in more detail. So just for full disclosure, this is my family, or part of my family. These are my nieces and nephew. And I took this at a holiday gathering. This is not atypical. You've probably seen this in your daily life, in your own families. This is, yeah, everywhere. So what I call this is alone together, which Sherry Turkle coined a number of years ago. This is another example of it. And what I call it is, it's a parallel play. If you remember your basic developmental behavioral science or developmental psychology, there's a stage in child development where children will play next to each other, but not with each other. So they play alongside. That's what we've developed for all of us. And if you watch people interact, even at dinner, they'll have their phones out and they'll be near each other, but not with each other. There's significant implications for this psychiatrically and from a mental health perspective, and actually from an addiction perspective as well. So how many of you think you overuse your phones or your devices? Yeah. How many of you would like to spend less time on them? I think most of us. And how many of you believe the internet can be addictive? Yeah. Okay, you all passed. And if you didn't raise your hands, I would have told you were lying. So the truth is that most of us spend too much time on it. And actually, if you look at the averages around the world, mostly, and actually this is not just in the Western world, but throughout the world, the average is somewhere between 4 hours on the low end and 7 hours of screen media consumption on the high end. And that's not including outliers. We technically, in terms of our treatment models, deal with outliers. And these are people that are spending 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 15 hours a day on technology. So that's a big, big amount of time.
Does that include television?
It can include television. The problem with television is that television and the internet have merged because of smart television and because of streaming. So it's getting harder to dissect that. It used to be easier, and I used to say to patients that I've never treated a TV addict. But now that's getting harder to say because if you're on Netflix on your television and you have it on auto start, you can sit there for 6 hours and you'll see a little video clip that kind of highlights that point. So it's changing. Television and the internet, they've talked about television and the internet merging for decades, but now it's really happened. So can you be addicted to the internet and smartphone? Well, we already know. Whoops. Why didn't that click? Yeah. Yeah, there you go. The answer is yes. So in part, the addiction is maintained by what I call reward deficiency syndrome, and I'll explain that. But essentially, you're elevating dopamine so much and so often that you end up dopaminergically depleted, and you lose the ability to generate natural levels of dopamine, endogenous as opposed to exogenous levels of dopamine. And so most people are walking around somewhat dopaminergically depleted, except that we walk around carrying our little portable dopamine pumps, which everyone's got. And you'll notice that you go to it quite often, and you're not sure why. Most of the time there's nothing there, but you're still going to it. So I want to show you this. This is the ASAM. I don't know if you're familiar with ASAM here. ASAM is the American Society of Addiction Medicine. And I like this definition. And if you take a quick look at it, this is really the gold standard for the definition of addiction. And what I like about it is that they talk about it, it's reflected in an individual pathologically pursuing reward and/or relief by substance use or other behaviors. So this includes behavioral and process addictions, which is what I'm talking about today, internet and technology addiction. But if you really look at this definition, it really fits for internet and technology addiction just as it does for substances, alcohol, drugs, gambling, etc. Okay, so this is a brain, a bit of a flat brain, but it's a brain. So what I wanted to show you mainly are the dopamine pathways. As you can see in the middle, you have the projections from the nucleus accumbens in yellow, and those are your dopamine pathways. The most significant is the nucleus accumbens in the middle. That's a major relay center for dopamine. That's what lights up when you have sex, when you eat, when you do any pleasurable behavior. And of course, when we do scans of brains with internet and digital behavior, it lights up just as well, especially with video gaming, social media, and other internet-related activities. So for all intents and purposes, your brain doesn't know the difference between what behavior is stimulating it for pleasure. The reward circuits are reward circuits. They're primitive, and they've been there for millions of years. The higher level cortical functions, the wrinkly part of the brain, the cortex, and the frontal area of the brain, that's new, a couple 100,000 years old. We're talking about reward circuits that are millions of years old, and they are fine-tuned to do one thing and one thing only: maximize pleasure and survival and decrease pain. That's it. And they are responsible in large part for addiction, and I'll explain why. I like this one. I'm worried Phil is an internet addict. He just snorted his mouse. Can you see that? You can see how old this is because look at the screen he's looking at. It's like an old black and white television. So I'm going to show you another little video clip, and it's a little longer, but I thought it's so good that I really wanted to show it to you. So bear with me, it's about 4 minutes.
What causes, say, heroin addiction? This is a really stupid question, right? It's obvious. We all know it. Heroin causes heroin addiction. Here's how it works. If you use heroin for 20 days, by day 21, your body would physically crave the drug ferociously because there are chemical hooks in the drug. That's what addiction means. But there's a catch. Almost everything we think we know about addiction is wrong. If you, for example, break your hip, you'll be taken to a hospital and you'll be given loads of diamorphine for weeks or even months. Diamorphine is heroin. It's in fact much stronger heroin than any addict can get on the street because it's not contaminated by all the stuff drug dealers dilute it with. There are people near you being given loads of deluxe heroin in hospitals right now. So at least some of them should become addicts. But this has been closely studied. It doesn't happen. Your grandmother wasn't turned into a junkie by her hip replacement. Why is that? Our current theory of addiction comes in part from a series of experiments that were carried out earlier in the 20th century. The experiment is simple. You take a rat and put it in a cage with 2 water bottles. One is just water, the other is water laced with heroin or cocaine. Almost every time you run this experiment, the rat will become obsessed with the drugged water and keep coming back for more and more until it kills itself. But in the 1970s, Bruce Alexander, a professor of psychology, noticed something odd about this experiment. The rat is put in the cage all alone. It has nothing to do but take the drugs. What would happen, he wondered, if we tried this differently? So he built Rat Park, which is basically heaven for rats. It's a lush cage where the rats would have colored balls, tunnels to scamper down, plenty of friends to play with, and they could have loads of sex. Everything a rat about town could want. And they would have the drugged water and the normal water bottles. But here's the thing. In Rat Park, rats hardly ever use the drugged water. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. But maybe this is a quirk of rats, right? Well, helpfully, there was a human experiment along the same lines, the Vietnam War. 20% of American troops in Vietnam were using a lot of heroin. People back home were really panicked because they thought there would be hundreds of thousands of junkies on the streets of the United States when the war was over. But a study followed the soldiers home and found something striking. They didn't go to rehab. They didn't even go into withdrawal. 95% of them just stopped after they got home. If you believe the old theory of addiction, that makes no sense. But if you believe Professor Alexander's theory, it makes perfect sense. Because if you're put into a horrific jungle in a foreign country where you don't want to be, and you could be forced to kill or die at any moment, doing heroin is a great way to spend your time. But if you go back to your nice home with your friends and your family, it's the equivalent of being taken out of that first cage and put into a human rat park. It's not the chemicals, it's your cage. We need to think about addiction differently. Human beings have an innate need to bond and connect. When we are happy and healthy, we will bond with the people around us. But when we can't, because we're traumatized, isolated, or beaten down by life, we will bond with something that gives us some sense of relief. It might be endlessly checking a smartphone, it might be pornography, video games, Reddit, gambling, or it might be cocaine. But we will bond with something because that is our human nature. The path out of unhealthy bonds is to form healthy bonds, to be connected to people you want to be present with. Addiction is just one symptom of the crisis of disconnection that's happening all around us. We all feel it. Since the 1950s, the average number of close friends an American has been steadily declining. At the same time, the amount of floor space in their homes has been steadily increasing. To choose floor space over friends, to choose stuff over connection. The war on drugs we've been fighting for almost a century now has made everything worse. Instead of helping people heal and getting their life together, we have cast them out from society. We have made it harder for them to get jobs and become stable. We take benefits and support away from them if we catch them with drugs. We throw them in prison cells, which are literally cages. We put people who are not well in a situation that makes them feel worse and hate them for not recovering. For too long, we've talked only about individual recovery from addiction. But we need now to talk about social recovery, because something has gone wrong with us as a group. We have to build a society that looks a lot more like Rat Park and a lot less like those isolated cages. We are going to have to change the unnatural way we live and rediscover each other. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection.
So I wanted to show you that because I think it's a great little video, and of course it's talking about addiction in general, including drugs, but what I really like about it is when it's specific reference to the internet, is that what the internet is all about social disconnection, not social connection. So although it is a form of self-comfort and numbing and self-medication, it's actually further isolating us and increasing all the markers for anxiety and depression. And that's been proven by the data over the last 15 years as smartphone penetration has increased worldwide. So in a sense where we think we're connecting and we're actually disconnecting, and we're increasing the very markers that we're trying to solve by addressing mental health issues. Also, this is based on a book called Chasing the Scream, The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs, which I would highly recommend by Johann Hari. Okay, the other thing I want to mention is that dopaminergic innervation from smartphones and from technology, or from actually everything, is twice the level from anticipation of the reward as it is from the actual reward. So when you get a little bleep or blip or vibration on your phone, you're going to spike a little bit of dopamine, but at double the level of the actual time that you check your device to see if something is there. And the reason for that is that our nervous system is tuned to elevate with anticipation for survival purposes, and I'll explain that a little bit more. So smartphone notifications are actually a constant source of neurobiological stimulation and also hormonal. It elevates cortisol, which is a stress hormone. And when you have an elevation of a stress hormone, the natural desire is to lower it. And the way you lower it is by what? Checking your phone. So not only are you getting rewarded, but you're also getting a lowering of cortisol, and this creates that cycle that we've been talking about. So I already mentioned, so basically addiction's the recognition that pain minimization and pleasure induction remembered through the hippocampal circuits facilitate activation of the reward pathways. Basically, your brain remembers what makes it feel good, and addiction is a complex set of consequences that's related to those reward circuits. We're piggybacking on primitive reward pathways, as I mentioned. These are millions of years old. You cannot change these. These are hardwired. And what we didn't know when we created technology or screen technology, internet, is that this would activate those pathways. Nobody had any idea. Back in the late 1990s when I started talking about this, and this is when we had dial-up internet, and there were no smartphones, no Wi-Fi, very different time. And I suggested that the internet might be addictive. We did a study with 18,000 subjects, and the media went crazy because it was almost heretical to suggest that this new thing that is so amazing could actually be addictive. So I'm not going to go into all these details, but you get the idea. These are the things that happen neurologically. The most important is hypofrontality. So when you activate those reward pathways, you're actually shutting down access to the executive functions in the prefrontal cortex. That's why addicts always do dumb things, and why we all do dumb things, right? Addicts and adolescents, and I'll talk about adolescents in a second. We have a lot in common, actually. The recent trends in neurobiology, actually somebody from England, Griffiths, he's done some amazing research on internet and technology addiction. He did a great retrospective study of all of the scanning studies on internet and technology addiction. And basically the bottom line is that there's something going on there. We don't know exactly what, but it is mimicking a lot of the things that we see with other addictions. I don't want to spend too much time on the details of the slide because I want to talk about treatment. Reward deficiency, I already mentioned that. We understand that. So this is important. I love this photo, by the way. The shorter the latency, the shorter the amount of time between the ingestion of a substance and the intoxication, or the performance of a behavior and the subsequent intoxication via elevation of dopamine and or lowering of cortisol, the more addictive that behavior or substance is. So what implications does that have for technology? Yeah, the faster it is, the more addictive it is, and that's exactly what we found. And that's why the numbers are off the charts now in terms of people needing services. We get calls every day from families. I talked to a 33-year-old man before I came here who is spending 12 hours plus a day on the internet, is disabled now, can't work, is about to lose his girlfriend, and he doesn't know what to do with himself. 12 hours a day and pushing it. Basically the only thing he does is sleep and use screens. So yes, the shorter the latency, the more addictive it is. So the more quickly you access your technology, the more readily accessible it is to you, the more likely it's going to be addictive. So these are kind of important. So why are smartphones and the internet? By the way, smartphones are just portable internet portals. If we took the internet away from your smartphone, you would lose interest in it very quickly. You wouldn't even want to use it. You might take a few photos with it, you might check your email or send a text, but you would lose interest, you would put it away. What makes it powerful is that it's an internet access portal. We did some research. These are some of the results of our original research and then some new stuff that we put in. But this is the first time we now have 2 generations raised on digital technology. So a whole new game is in town now. It shifts time and space. So you can be in 2 places at once with this technology. You can be here, and then you're on your phone and you're somewhere else. It gives the illusion of bilocation. The problem is, on a social level, it actually conveys a message to everyone around you that you're not available for connection, and it defacilitates social interaction and social intimacy. It also defacilitates creativity. So one of the things that we know about technology is that the more we use it, the less creative we are and the less socially interactive we are, not the more. Facebook doesn't exist to connect people, it exists to make sure your eyes are on the screen. I think everybody knows that. Broadcast intoxication. So this is the first time in human history that everybody on the planet has the ability to send and receive information instantly. That's very intoxicating for people. And here's the most important thing, the maybe factor. The brain loves maybe. So the internet is the world's largest slot machine. Do you call them slot machines here? Because in Australia they call them pokies. So I don't know if there was a... So the internet's the world's largest slot machine. What does that mean? Every time you go online and you check something, it doesn't matter what device you're on or what you're doing online. There's a variability to what you're going to find, when you're going to find it, and how good it's going to be. That variability is very resistant to extinction if you remember your behavioral science. The idea is that when you can't predict a reward in terms of what, when, and how, or what, when, and how much, it's more likely that you're going to become addicted to that pattern of behavior. That's why people stand in front of slot machines for hours, because they can't predict when they're going to get it. If they knew they were going to get a certain amount of money every time they push the button, they would walk away instantly. If your smartphone was exactly predictable in everything it did in terms of your social media, your email, your text, everything you did on it, you would lose interest in it. It's the variability. So the internet is the world's largest, the smartphone is the world's smallest. Productivity illusion, make no bones about it. We are 80% of the time people spend on devices is not for productivity. Not for productivity. We think we're using it for work or productivity, but 80% of the time is for everything other than productivity. And if you look at the data on academic performance, it is actually dropped as a result of an inclusion of technology and school systems. So if you look at the scores before and after, they've dropped. It does not help productivity. It's an illusion. I'm not saying we shouldn't use it, but it's not a productivity enhancer. Time distortion dissociation. This is a question I always ask the audience. How many of you lose track of time when you're on your devices? This is almost universal. So we're unable to track time. We dissociate. Dissociation is very pleasant. You go to a good movie and you dissociate. And you lose track of time, and it's a pleasant experience. It's very, very powerful, though. And so consequently, you have a drug that's very powerful that you lose track of how much you use and when you use it. And that's very, very significant. Elevated cortisol, I mentioned. Instant gratification is obvious. No boundaries. This is an interesting phenomenon. All forms of communication, like a movie, a magazine, a book, a conversation, everything, television show, has a beginning, middle, and end. The internet does not. If you doubt that, check your news in the morning and try to get through your news without clicking on some other story, either accidentally or on purpose. It's impossible. There are no boundaries. And the brain loves boundaries and loves completion. So it strives for completion. In so doing, what it does is it keeps clicking till it can finish the internet. Good luck with that. Infotainment, very obvious, so everybody just scrolls on it because it's fun. But what you're doing is you're just pumping a little dopamine into your brain without realizing it. And it's social connection without social risk or effort. I would argue that it's not really social connection. It's anti-social connection, as I mentioned. There's also a perception of anonymity. People still think it's somewhat anonymous. It's the least anonymous form of communication on the planet. If you don't want somebody to know something, do not send it through a digital platform. There's a record of everything, and I've seen those records brought to my office in legal cases. So this is something I want to mention. It's an important concept, synergistic amplification. So there's an interaction between the internet medium, this variable medium, and the content, because you can have stimulating content as well. Everybody knows video games can be addictive, and they can be addictive, by the way, regardless of what platform they're delivered on. You can have a handheld video game or a console video game not even hooked to the internet, and that can be addictive. It's got saliency and reward properties and dopaminergic properties on its own. Same with pornography. Pornography has been around since hieroglyphics. I won't go into too much detail about it, but pornography is stimulating unto itself, and there are other things on the internet, of course, that have stimulating factors. But when you combine a stimulating form of content with a variable delivery system like the internet, it's like pouring gasoline on a fire. That's synergistic amplification. You have the ability to generate more intensity because of that variable delivery mechanism, the ease of access and the immediacy coupled with the stimulating content. So I'm not going to go too much about pornography. We could do a whole hour and a half, 2, 3, 4 hours about pornography. But just suffice it to say that red item there, 90% of boys and 60% of girls are exposed to pornography by age 18. Those statistics are pretty consistent worldwide, except in the countries where it's blocked. So basically, your children are learning about sex for the most part through internet pornography. In the United States, and I don't know what the numbers are here in Great Britain, but 40% of American communities do not offer sex education. Only 60% do. So where do you think they're learning about sex? Now let me ask you, not that any of you have ever watched pornography, but do you think that what's depicted in pornography, assuming you can guess what's on it, do you think that's a realistic depiction of human sexual behavior? Yeah, not in my wildest imagination. It's nice to dream, but no, it's not. But actually, I call it the pornification of sex. It's this confusion that's been created among the last couple of generations that they don't really know what sex is. And there are other issues associated with watching a lot of pornography online. I'm going to show you a very quick clip.
The internet is really, really great.
For porn.
I got a fast connection, so I don't have to wait.
For porn.
There's always some new site.
For porn.
I browse all day and night.
For porn.
It's like I'm surfing at the speed of light.
For porn.
Turkey.
The internet is for porn.
Turkey.
The internet is for porn.
What are you doing?
Why you think the net was born? Porn, porn, porn. Skip up a doo bop, skip up
Turkey.
Wah, wah.
Get down here.
Oh, yeah.
That's gross. You're a pervert.
Sticks and stones.
Okay, it keeps going, but so that's for those of you that didn't haven't seen that before. That's from a Broadway play, and I'm sure that was here also, called Avenue Q, and that's one of the title songs of the play. Believe it or not, it was banned in some locations because of that song. I don't need to explain it. So we already talked about variable reinforcement. By the way, this photo, the self-disclosure, this is a slot machine app on a smartphone. This is a screenshot of it. It's from my smartphone. I downloaded this app and I played it for 2 weeks straight, and I like stopped eating for those 2 weeks. Like it just shows you how powerful it is. And there's no money involved. It's just variable reward and the ease of access, the fact that it's in your pocket. I think we can skip this. So children and adolescents are most susceptible to internet addiction, and I'll tell you why, although none of us are immune for it. So this is a really interesting chart. This shows the split between the development of the nucleus accumbens and the prefrontal cortex. And although it doesn't plot by age, that sort of largest separation point in the middle is about 15 or 16 years old. So what that means is that the nucleus accumbens is at its peak of development. It hits its peak level of maturation and of dopaminergic receptivity. So it's primed for pleasure. Now, there is a biological reason for that, which we'll talk about in a second. But at the same time, the development, as you all know, the development of the frontal lobes and prefrontal cortex is very slow, and it takes probably into the early 20s, mid-20s, for it to develop, and for some of us, it never develops. So notice, because of that shallow curve, there's a great gap between the development of the prefrontal cortex, which is executive skills and functions, and pleasure dynamics. And there's another aspect of this, which is on the next slide, which is that the development of GABA is also, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, is also lower at that peak period when you have greater dopaminergic sensitivity and receptivity. So GABA is sort of like the water that quenches the fire. It sort of tamps down that dopaminergic innervation. The prefrontal cortex is supposed to use executive skills to slow it down. And we know in addiction, we shut off those pathways to the prefrontal cortex. And so it's a perfect storm for addiction. And that's why the peak number of the patients that we typically see in our clinic started around age 13. That's the youngest age I've seen, and then go up into their early 30s. Most of the time, and this is true of addiction medicine in general, addictions tend to run their course well into their early 30s and 40s, although some people don't stop, obviously. But the peak level of addiction susceptibility and proclivity and neurobiologic sensitivity starts in the teens and goes well into the early 20s and sometimes later. So the bulk of our patients are in that sweet spot. They have that vulnerability and it's mostly neurobiologic. So this is why we talk about adolescence being a disease. It sort of is, because their neurobiological development isn't there. So when you tell an adolescent, why don't you think, it's because they can't. Sort of, they really can't. They don't have the capacity to do it. So when I have a 13-year-old patient who is, he was referred to me because of his kind of pornography sort of addiction, where he would also post photos of himself kind of showing off his six-pack, and in exchange for girls sending him naked photos. And he was quite good at this. He was getting, and these are young girls. He was getting them sent to him from all over the country. And when I would talk to him and I'd say, well, do you think that was a good idea to do that? I mean, he would say no, but he would say no because he knew that's what I wanted to hear. I think what he was really saying is, wow, yeah, this is an amazing idea. And I'm thinking to himself, yeah, I wish I could do that. But nobody's going to pay me to see my six-pack. It's more like a 2-liter bottle. So this is what I mentioned before. The braking system of dopamine is GABA. And it drops in early puberty and then slowly climbs back up into the early 20s, which is exactly the same time that you're developing the frontal cortex. So your ability to manage these reward pushes drops or increases as you age into your mid-20s. So for internet and technology addiction, the sweet spot is 10, 12 in the low end and on into the mid to late 20s on the high end. Except this patient that I talked to is 33. And the prognosis for him is very poor. If he does not get help, this guy he may not make it. Because don't forget, he's on 12 hours a day. So internet addiction doesn't have the morbidity and the mortality that opiates do. It doesn't have respiratory suppression. But there are deaths that come as a result. And the deaths are not direct. Although some people play and are online so much that they end up with DVTs or electrolyte imbalances and they drop dead. That's rare, it happens. Or the other way you can die from excess technology addiction is your kid can kill you when you take it away, and that also happens. Doesn't happen every day, but actually in my own town there was a case where that occurred recently, where the mother took away the internet or the device from the child, and he killed his sister and tried to kill her. So it does happen. But really what was I talking about? I lost track. Shoot. Oh, so this particular patient, the reason why he's really, I think, at serious risk of dying is that he's not going to doctors, he's not taking care of himself, he's not sleeping, he's eating poorly, he's got metabolic issues, and I think he's at risk for severe medical complications if he doesn't get off of this 12-hour plus a day use. Because the highlight of internet addiction is that in order to really meet the criteria for addiction, which we'll talk about what those criteria are, you got to spend a lot of time on it. And when you spend a lot of time on something, you're going to imbalance your life in a significant way. I mean, that's really the hallmark of the danger with internet, is the amount of time it eats. Yeah.
How do you delineate from the use today in education?
Yeah, why don't we, let's hold that question to the end. I want to answer that, but I'm going to cover some of that. I'm sorry, but I will answer it.
Architects of our digital world. Stop. Be better. because we can be. And we can see that these systems have been designed with intricacy so that companies can keep our attention indefinitely. I don't want to keep crushing these freaking candies. I don't want these alerts to completely command me. I don't care if that panda bear is dancing. Well, maybe. With a hula hoop. Okay, this is fantastic. I have to share this with my 10 friends and 10,000 strangers. Caption, who wants to throw a panda rager? Great, let me go back about my life. For God's sakes, I'm trying to right swipe my wife. Huh.
Watch this.
30 seconds and just 2 Facebook likes. Or is that just 2 for which I've been notified? Let me go back and check inside and see whose likes it tried to hide. They don't show them all, I wonder why. This panda's dancing. And another video plays after automatically. This one of a gopher that stage turns dramatically. It's like my attention is kept systematically raptured by algorithms that know exactly what I want. Or not what I want, just what I'll watch. And the people behind this intelligent design genuinely want to better our lives. But their bonuses just so happen to be tied to keeping time on site exceptionally high. And now even my news apps have been gamified, and what am I, not gonna click that one simple sex tip guaranteed to blow her mind? Wait, where was I, and why have I forgotten to look for that thing I'm supposed to find? And my God, look at the time. It is shocking. But somehow, yes, Netflix, I am still watching. And I know. I should have more self-control. But just to be clear, you just spent $1 million telling me this story designed to cut off at the end, leaving me wanting more. See, of course I want to see what you have in store. See my cursor already waiting there on the screen floor as you tease the next hour in all of its glory. And you'll give it to me, unless I actively abort. See, it seems the decision's already made for me. The countdown clock's moving. There it goes. 5, 4, 3. I need to sleep. But you made me want this more. This is not what I consciously signed up for when I hit play on one episode 6 hours ago. Architects of our digital world, you have more data, information, and control over our attention, the tools to tweak our emotions so we'll return to your experience. But is that what you should do? Or should you build digital tools so advanced they can actually enhance the world outside the device in our hands? Can you add so much value that it lets us put our phones back in our pants as fast as we possibly can? Not time-sucking, time-giving innovation. That's what it means to be truly technologically advanced. The future is not all screens. It's humanity enhanced.
I don't know about that, because I think he walks up to a stranger and gives her a flower. Oh, you think that would go over? Yeah. Okay, I was wrong. So digital content's clearly addictive. So what he mentioned in there was a very important point. Companies use, like Facebook, or all social media companies actually, use behavioral engineers. These are psychologists, psychiatrists, other behavioral scientists, who design the platforms to dole out your likes and comments in a variable format. They know behavioral science. So they don't give you all your likes or your checks or your comments all at once. They hold them, and they dole them out with an algorithm that's variable and unpredictable. Even if you put something that's hot on and you know that it's going to get a lot of likes, they don't give them to you all at once. And so they're actually shaping your behavior to be more likely to post. And they develop what's called a social validation loop, which is you post so you can get likes, but you get them in a variable format, and then that's more likely, so you'll post. But really, they don't care about your posting or your likes. What they care about is that your eyes are on the screen. That's what they're doing. And they're all doing it, and they're controlling our behavior based on that. And it's all neurobiologic. So let's talk about epidemiology and prevalence. These are worldwide statistics. Internet addiction is, studies look at it everywhere from, I've seen studies as low as 1%. Some people would argue that it doesn't exist. Most of the studies are coming in somewhere between 2 and 15%. I have copies of all of those prevalence studies. If people want to email me, I can send them to you. There's so many of them. You know, when I started this research and my work, there was one book on the subject, one study, and my book was the second book in the world on the subject, and there was no research. I mean, nothing. And now when I do a site review, there's thousands of studies that have been done, and hundreds of instruments to look at it, and hundreds of questions with regard to diagnosis and etiology. It's a completely different field now than it was when I started in 1997, 98. So there's limited definitions of internet use disorder. In fact, we don't have a name for it yet. You'll hear different names: internet use disorder, internet addiction disorder, pathological internet use, problematic internet use, did I say internet addiction? Video game addiction, video game disorder. I mean, it's all over the map. Nobody really knows what to call it. I generally use the term internet addiction. Sometimes I'll use internet use disorder. The reason why I like internet use disorder is it mimics the DSM-5 in terms of use disorders: substance use, alcohol use, internet use. But we don't really have an official name. Now, that being said, there's some changes that have occurred, not because of American Psychiatric, but because of the World Health Organization. Internet addiction probably exists on a continuum, with sort of mild on one end and severe on another end. I don't think it's the same disorder for everybody. I don't think everybody does it the same way. I don't think the severity is the same. And in terms of treatment, not everybody needs treatment. In fact, Christoph highlighted this. Most of us need treatment in the sense that we need to modify our use patterns. The vast majority of people do not need to see a doctor or a therapist for treatment. I would place that percentage on a fairly low end, somewhere between 1 and 5%. And if you look at the addiction studies, only 10% of the population ever really needs treatment for some kind of an addiction, and those numbers are high in some cases. So a lot of people use devices addictively or compulsively or overuse them, but they don't necessarily would not necessarily meet the criteria of addiction, which I'll talk about. So etiology, nobody really knows what the true etiology of internet use disorder is. I think it has to do with basic neurobiology that I mentioned. There does not seem to be a predisposition, except for one area, which I will mention. And I already talked about overuse versus addiction. Genetic studies, very mixed, not a lot going on there. But I do believe ADD, ADHD is a possible epigenetic co-contributing factor due to its high frequency of co-occurrence with internet and technology issues. Now, that does not mean that those of us that overuse technology all have ADD, but people who I treat, people who actually need treatment, 90 to 95% of them have a pre-existing diagnosis of ADD, or they are diagnosed by me when they come in. Almost all of them. So why is that an issue? So that's a co-occurring condition. It's pre-morbid. It happens. These people had it long before the internet. Although the internet co-contributes to it, but one of the features of ADD is lower activation of dopamine in the orbital prefrontal area. So that's interesting because that's one of the highlights that we see with internet addiction, is that there's a depletion of dopamine in the prefrontal cortex. So we think, this is a theory, that people are self-medicating. That someone with ADD loves the internet and loves screens because it's a way of activating dopamine as best they can through, and so they're really sort of taking care of business without realizing it. But it makes them very, very susceptible, because you take someone with ADD and then take their screens away, and they don't know how to manage their life. And one of the highlights of what they talk about is boredom. I'm in the process of writing an article on boredom. Boredom is one of the main triggers, by the way, for use of all technology, for all of us, by the way. Everyone in here will pick up their phone when they're bored. We've become a boredom-intolerant world. So boredom is part of life. It's part of normal life. where you have those moments of self-reflection, of nothingness, and during those times, apparently, just like during sleep, certain important things happen. There are two very important things happen when you're bored. The two very important things are social compilation, or I'm not using the right word, but the desire to connect socially comes out of boredom, and also the creative spark. Creativity comes out of boredom. So two things that we become so intolerant of boredom that we don't wait for that next best or next great thought or the next desire to connect to another human being. Go into a waiting room or a bank line or a post office, which in the United States is a very painful experience, and you'll see nobody standing there and doing nothing. They're all looking at their screen. Now, remember what I said about people holding their screens? It conveys a message that they are not available. It's like having a sign out to lunch. So it decreases social interaction. Even though they may be socially interacting, although I doubt it, they're conveying a message to everyone in the world. So we wonder why people are feeling greater levels of alienation and social disconnection. So, and try a little experiment. Next time you go in a waiting room, don't pull out your phone. Watch how you feel. Now, I remember when I first started doing this work, taking your phone out was actually considered inappropriate. The social electronic etiquette was to not have your phone out. Now the electronic etiquette is to have your phone out, and if you don't have it out, you're weird. You're like looking to kill somebody, because you're looking around the room and looking at people, and people aren't used to people looking at anybody. So numerous models for etiology of internet use disorder. I'm not going to go into these. You could just do a search and you'll see probably 100. This is I did a publication in 2010 that talks about my model, which is both neurobiological and dopaminergic, as well as some social models. It's in a book actually by Kimberly Young, who just passed away. She was one of the early pioneers, actually predating me. She did the first small-scale study on internet. I did the second large-scale study, and she just passed away this last February. So she was really a pioneer in the area, and there's a great book that she wrote called Internet Addiction, and in that book is a chapter where I outline some of my theories about what creates internet addiction. But it's actually a real loss. Okay, so consequences of internet addiction: increased depression, anxiety, I already talked about. Shortened attention span, very obvious. Sexual desensitization. How many people have seen ED with their patients? Yeah, I've seen several cases of it. They look at a lot of porn, and then, pornography. For erection, you need three things: blood supply, hormonal level, and you need neurologic, psychologic stimulation, tactile or visual or internal. And pornography desensitizes them. They literally, they've seen it all, literally, and they really have. And so real life sex doesn't do it. It's actually quite shocking, and these cases are not old. These are mostly in their late teens and early 20s. Tech stress syndrome, elevated cortisol levels, I mentioned. Sleep and circadian. So sleep is the #1 issue that suffers because of internet addiction, along with academic and work performance. Because when you're spending excessive amounts of time online, the one area you're going to rob it from is sleep or productivity time. So you're going to cut into your sleep, either staying up too late or getting up early, or not sleeping at all, and you're going to cut into your work and academic performance time. So those are all the other issues. These are all covered in research. The ones in green are the ones that I see the most. Relationship impact is also a significant issue, both in intimate relationships and family relationships. #1 reason for seeking treatment, at least in our clinic, is decreased academic or work performance. #1 reason. None of these other reasons bring them in the door. What brings them in the door is they went off to college, or university, as you say here, and they did not get any credits. They went off for a semester or 2 or 3, and they barely passed, or they flunked everything, and their parents have spent, $100,000 to $150,000, and they have nothing. to show for it, or very little. And it's because they got into their room, they were not supervised, they had a screen in front of them, and they were basically, they might as well have been a heroin addict with an endless supply of heroin in their room. Whoops. The other interesting thing is that we've tracked this for a long time. As every country, for every 10% rise that countries spend on information and internet technology infrastructure, there's a 1% increase in obesity rates among children and adolescents. So we've seen in the United States probably a 70 or 80% rise in childhood and adolescent obesity. In fact, among young adults, the rates are so high that the military is getting concerned because they can't get recruits that are healthy enough to pass the basic entry physical because of their excess weight. And this is due to sedentary behavior, basically sedentary behavior. So here's an interesting thing, and I don't know, I'm not as familiar with Great Britain, but or the United Kingdom, but when I was growing up, and with most people over the age of 40 were growing up, they spent the majority of their playtime outside, outdoors. And it's literally true now, and this is shocking. In the United States, almost no child spends any time outdoors, at least in most neighborhoods in the United States. Most of their time is indoor time. And most of that time that's indoors is in front of a screen. This is short. I don't know what's wrong with the audio. We checked this 10 times last night, and it worked fine. I love that direct action. So that's a pretty typical scene. And actually, if you go into any restaurant, you'll see this. You don't have to go into people's homes. That's what people do. They're parallel playing. They're not interacting. Except for that girl. She goes out and raises hell. So let's talk about diagnosis and assessment, because I know we're running short of time. I'm sorry I spent so much time on background, but it's important you understand some of the background behind internet addiction to understand the treatment of it. And the treatment, the good news is you probably already know how to treat most of it. If you have any background in addiction medicine or addiction treatment, you know how to do it. So I use an addiction medicine model. I look at internet use from an addiction perspective. That doesn't mean that people who are internet addicts are bad people, just like any addict. People who have an addiction have a problem, and that problem needs to be solved. The reason why I use an addiction model is because it's the model that most fits for what I'm doing and for how we do it. If you try to treat it with a straight mental health model, and you treat it without using an addiction-informed perspective, like most of the patients that come to us have been seen by a lot of doctors and therapists prior to getting to us, it will not work. Because general psychotherapy and counseling for this issue will not work. I can guarantee that. Don't try it. It's a waste of time. They'll tell you all the things you want to hear. They'll have all the insight you want to hear. You can do cognitive behavioral therapy to up the wazoo, and they will have the right cognitions, and they will go home and click. Okay? So, if you're treating an alcoholic and you do the same research and they go home and they have a refrigerator full of beer, they're going to be more likely to relapse. So ease of access and accessibility is a huge trigger response for all addictions. And the internet, think about how many screens are available to us and the ease of access and accessibility for those screens. So that's a problem. Look at this kid. That's pretty typical. So diagnostic considered. There's no agreed upon diagnostic criteria for internet use disorder. I think the best set of criteria right now are either the provisional criteria in the DSM-5 or the new criteria in the WHO ICD-11 that is supposed to come, it's out. The insurance companies, at least in the United States, have not put it into their systems, but it is out and those criteria are accessible online. Warning signs, this is pretty obvious. Change in work and school behavior, social, family involvement decrease, and a positive increase in time spent online, computer, smartphone use, etc. This is important, though. There are socially adaptive and normative aspects to gaming, tweeting, texting, messaging, etc. So you take an adolescent who's 15, 16 in high school, and you say you can't use your phone or do social media anymore, they're going to look at you and say, "Fuck you," basically. They're not going to do it, and they really will say that. You have to allow for normative use and figure out a way to sort of block things that are most problematic and let go of things that are not. I mean, taking away social media for an adolescent, Instagram or Snapchat, is really not doable because that is their main modality of communication. They are all textographic. They are not verbal. They've moved away from verbal communication. They are a new species. And I mean that sincerely. They really don't use verbal skills anymore. Now, that's a problem, but you remember when rock and roll music came around, everyone said that it was going to be the end of civilization. We're saying the same thing about this generation. It probably isn't, but it is creating a new civilization. I like this one. So I'm addicted to the internet because it's more interesting than people. Is there a pill you can give to everyone to make them more interesting? Doctors never want to treat the underlying problem. So these are the DSM-5. You can look this up online. Provisional criteria for internet gaming disorder. It applies to all internet use. So you just substitute the word internet for internet games or social media. These are pretty good. And they were developed with some focus on research. Actually, one of the doctors that was involved in it also passed away. I'm starting to get nervous that all of the experts on internet addiction are dying, and two of them have died this year. Dr. Nancy Petrie worked on these criteria, and she just published a book posthumously on internet addiction. Another great loss to the field. WHO, I mentioned already. Take a look at those criteria. They're pretty good and pretty similar. There's also a great video on the WHO website that is great for patients and family members around internet use disorder and video gaming disorder. It's about a 5-minute, 6-minute video that you could download, and it's on YouTube, so you can upload it and then you show it to patients. I use a lot of video and a lot of PowerPoint and a lot of audio with my patients. Why? Because that's the modality they love. So I have a huge screen in my office. You might say, well, that's ridiculous, Why? So they come into my office, they expect to see like a teepee and a fire in the middle of the room. And they see like 6 screens, all linked together, and a 50-inch screen on the wall. But I use what I know will reach them. So I show them videos all the time along with, and then I intersperse it with, obviously, with verbal communication. Differential diagnosis. So obviously when you're diagnosing anything, you have to rule out other things that might be variables. So you want to look at oppositional defiant behavior, impulse control issues, explosive disorders, various mood disorders. Generally, you'll see symptoms of all of those things, but really what you're looking for is what's the primary cause of those things. So a standard workup should include questions about their screen use. Ask them about their screen use. Say, hey, how much time you spend on screens? You don't have to say, is screen use a problem for you? Because anyone that works with addictions knows that what answer you're going to get. No, I don't have a problem with it. So just say, how much screens do you use? And they'll answer you. They'll tell you. They'll probably, just like when you do a workup for alcohol, they'll underreport by about 50%. So you can generally take whatever number they give you and double it, and you'll probably have pretty close to the right number. So ask about and then when you say screens, talk about gaming, internet, smartphones, tech use, tablets, you can mention all the different things. These are some screening tools. The PIUQ, the PURIS, PRIUSS, Internet Addiction Test, and then the Internet Addiction Scale is mine. You can go on our website, you just type in virtual-addiction.com, and you'll see a lot of the screening tools on there. But these are probably 5 or 6 of the big ones. And there's more being developed all the time, and they're much better than when I developed my early ones. They have much better psychometrics than the ones that I developed. This is what's on the Internet Addiction Scale, one of mine. You know, not all this dissimilar. I honestly think if you use the DSM-5 or the ICD-11, you'll be good to go. I mean, I think if they answer 5 or 6 of those questions positively, you're more likely to be positively correlated with a problem. ADD and internet use disorder I already mentioned. I'm gonna move on real quick. So what's the goal of treatment? Well, abstinence can happen, right? You're gonna tell people not to use the internet? Good luck with that. That's not gonna happen. When I started treating people in the late 90s, that's exactly what we did, because back in the late 90s, there was nothing on the internet. Even porn wasn't really working very well then. So we would actually prescribe not using the internet. But we learned very quickly that you can't do that today. It's not possible. So abstinence is not a model. Really what you're looking for is a moderated, mindful, or sustainable use model. So unlike, you know, with alcohol abuse, it's very controversial to use a moderated drinking model, although some people think it works. But for the most part, it's an abstinence-based model. This is a moderated use model. So you're teaching them how to use in a moderated format. Now, what's moderated mean? Moderated means you're going to have to probably limit or block the problematic content areas. So if you do this work, you need an IT person to do it with you. It's sort of like doing substance abuse work without the ability to get a UTOX screen. You need to know what's going on, and the only way to know what's going on is to have an IT person monitoring or helping you figure out how to monitor. There's apps that you can buy or download. One is Circle, there's Custodio, there's many of them out there that are off the shelf, but unless you're skilled and facile in technology, it's better to work with a tech expert who will help you set these up. If you have a gaming addict and you don't block gaming on their router and on their devices, you'll probably not be successful, in my opinion. On an outpatient level. On a residential level, you have more control. But on an outpatient level, if you're working with them 1, 2, 3 times a week, whatever it is, you're not going to have a lot of time to really monitor what they're doing. So I'm a big advocate of using blocks, monitors, and filters. Now, it's controversial. Some people would say that's, a violation of people's privilege, and it might be. But if you want them to get better, you're going to have to do it. Now, they're not going to like it, but part of your job is to do motivational interviewing and motivational enhancement. You want to get buy-in from them. And the way you get buy-in is through the building of that rapport and that motivational enhancement. So let's move on. We're out of time. Is my watch slow? Oh, I'm over time. Oh, God. All right. Well, I think I covered most of the details, but there's a couple of things I didn't, but my apologies. My watch was slow. You're welcome. Sorry about that.